Scary Things Police Have Seen, Part 31. Sometimes the scariest things aren't paranormal. This story is the point of view of a gas station convenience store worker. A suspicious looking man came in, walked around the store, went back out, pumped his gas, and left without paying. The woman was able to get the license plate number, and she called the police to report what had happened. Less than an hour later, a police officer went to the convenience store to speak with her. The police officer asked her to identify the man, which she did. It turns out the man she had seen was wanted for 2 murders. He had murdered a convenience store clerk after kidnapping her and robbing her. The police officer told her that him walking in the store, all suspicious-like, was the exact same thing he did when he murdered the other woman. Needless to say, the writer of the story feels very lucky he didn't do to her what he had done before. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 32. This is another story from near Espanola, New Mexico. A detective from Espanola was driving a rural mountain road to Chama, which has a history of witchcraft. At about sunset, the detective saw a wolf on a small hill on the side of the road. He had never seen a wolf in that area before, so he got ready to take a picture. The detective saw the wolf look at him, stand up on his hind legs, and run down the opposite side of the mountain, out of sight. This story was sent to me by Jeremy Betancourt. Thank you, Jeremy. He said that this detective was a very serious guy and wouldn't make something like this up. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 33. This story is from the Honolulu Police Department. One rookie officer spoke about patrolling the Poly Lookout one night. She was assigned to lock the gates along the highway. She locked the first gate and then drove along the highway to the second gate. She saw a strange woman dressed in white walking on the side of the road. What do cops do? They investigate. So she pulled over to ask the woman if she was all right. The officer looked down to roll down the window, looked back up, and the woman was gone. The rookie had an eerie feeling like she wasn't alone and looked in the rearview mirror. The woman in white was in her back seat. The officer remembered her grandmother telling her to remain calm if she ever encountered a spirit. The officer continued driving to her destination and started talking to the spirit in order to stay calm. The woman never replied. The rookie got out of her vehicle to lock the second gate, and when she went back to her car, the spirit was gone. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 34. In 1997, a woman purchased a house that used to be used as a hospital. She lived there by herself until there was a home invasion robbery. The criminals broke in, tied her to a chair, and brutally murdered her. Years later, a static 911 call came from the house. 2 officers responded. When they arrived, they found the house was empty. The officers asked dispatch to call the number back, but the line was disconnected. A few minutes later, dispatch called the officers and told them to come back to the station immediately. The dispatcher was listening to the call and decided to turn the frequency all the way up. In the audio, a muffled voice could be heard. The voice said, "Help me, help me. They are going to kill me." This story was sent to me by Cody Flynn, whose father was one of the officers that responded that night. Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 35. This story was sent to me by a Louisiana police officer. Thanks, buddy. He told me this encounter made him believe in the paranormal. About 2 weeks ago, this officer and his partner were dispatched to a break-in. They arrived and could clearly hear movement inside the house. They went inside, and in the back room, they heard objects moving and heard a television turn on. They made commands for the person inside to come out with their hands up. At that moment, the television turned off and the door flew open. There was no one there, but the officers could hear faint footsteps walking past them in the hallway. They searched the room and there was no one there. They searched the rest of the house, and in the living room, the officer felt something pull on his ear. But there was no one there. When the homeowner showed up, they explained to him what happened. The homeowner said his father used to live there, and he was a violent man who used to twist the kids' ears a lot, but he died 2 weeks ago. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 36. This story was sent to me by a deputy in Ohio. One night, he responded to a house to assist an elderly lady. The lady called and complained about her neighbor's horses whinnying, neighing, running around at all hours of the night. The lady also had dementia and was the only one living in the area, so the deputy thought the complaint was due to her mental status. Yet, the deputy made the decision to investigate just in case. The neighbor's house had been abandoned for 10 years, and he wanted to check to see if anyone was squatting inside. He looked around the inside of the house, which had no doors or windows. He found no one inside. As he checked the backside of the house, he noticed a crumbling barn on the property. As he walked closer to the abandoned barn, he heard, clear as day, the sound of horses walking, neighing, and whinnying. He left the location, and I don't blame him because I wouldn't want to mess with some demon horses either. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 37. This video, one of the creepiest I've ever seen, was sent to me by a police officer in South Carolina. He responded to a residence because of motion being picked up in an upstairs bedroom. He got there and the house was completely secure. The homeowner shows up, lets them inside. They don't find anyone in there, and nothing was disturbed. He pulls up video from an indoor surveillance camera, and this is what they see. Come to find out, the residence was previously owned by a family that had passed away from natural causes, except one small boy. There was never a death record for him, but he went missing after his 9th birthday. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 38. This story was sent to me by a police officer in Missouri. An elderly lady passed away alone in her home. This officer and his partner arrived to conduct a death investigation. The officers waited for the county coroner to arrive in the same room where the body was found. While waiting, a broom leaning on the back of the couch fell to the ground. It startled them, but brooms fall down all the time, right? A few seconds after the broom fell, a small hand exercising device fell from off the dining room table. But the device was originally in the center of the table. There wasn't a draft in the house, and no explanation as to why the objects fell. But all these objects fell in the same room where the deceased was found. What do you think? The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 39. This story was sent to me by a police officer in Texas. This took place at Laredo College, which is made up from an old military fort, and near the river that separates the US and Mexico. Late at night, the officer was watching the road next to the river. He saw 4 people marching in a single file line across the road and down to the river. The officer investigated to see what was going on, but he couldn't follow them because he couldn't find any footprints in the dirt. He made his way down to the river and still couldn't find anyone. He said there was no way for 4 individuals to walk that direction and not leave some kind of trace. He called for assistance and a senior officer arrived. He explained what happened to him, and the officer laughed. He said, "You saw ghosts from the old fort. Back in the day, it was common for soldiers to march down to the river together to fetch water. Apparently their ghosts walk the same path today." The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 40. I love paranormal stories from different cultures. This story was sent to me by the son of a police officer in Australia. The officer was on patrol with his partner, who was an Aboriginal elder. They were in the Northern Territory about 3 hours from civilization. When they stopped, the officer noticed on the side of a road a lot of footprints. The footprints looked like they belonged to children and led towards a mountain off in the distance. The officer asked his Aboriginal partner what he thought, and he said, "I have no clue." When they got back to the station, the officer talked to his supervisor about what happened. The supervisor knew exactly what he was talking about. He spoke of a traditional indigenous story about tiny people who lived in the mountains who would come down and steal from locals. He also said the indigenous people were not allowed to talk about them, and his partner would deny what they saw. Sure enough, when the officer spoke to his partner again about what happened, the partner denied ever seeing footprints in the first place. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 41. This story was sent to me by a corrections officer in Arizona. He worked at a jail in Kingman, which has an old legend about a little girl which haunts its halls. Her name is Delilah. One night, this officer was working alone in a control room after the facility lockdown. While looking at the control panel, the officer saw in the corner of his eye what appeared to be someone's head and shoulders looking over the panel at him. He looked over the panel and saw nothing. About 30 minutes later, the officer felt something tug on the back of his uniform. He also heard a soft giggle. When he turned around, there was no one there. He told the corporal about what happened, and he responded, "Well, I guess Delilah likes you." The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 42. This story was sent to me by a police officer in California who wished to be anonymous. On June 17th, 2002, an air tanker crashed near Walker, California, while on a firefighting mission. The crash was even caught on camera. An officer saw the crash and ran to it. While running through the forest, he came upon 3 men in flight suits who seemed dazed and confused. He asked them if they saw the crash, but they wouldn't respond to him. Since they weren't helpful, he continued on. When he got to the crash site, he found that all passengers on board were killed. There were 3 men on board that plane. The officer went back to where he saw the men in the forest, but he couldn't find them anywhere. No one else who responded to the crash site had seen them. The officer then realized that the 3 men he saw in the forest were the spirits of the crew members that died that day. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 43. This was sent to me by a police officer in Three Forks, Montana. In the town, there is a historic hotel built in 1882. Officers frequently respond for strange noise complaints. One evening, this officer responded there for a call about a suspicious person. A bartender said she was getting ready to close for the night when she heard something strange upstairs. She investigated, and in a storage space upstairs, she saw a man dressed in a white coat and wearing a chef's hat. She was terrified and called 911. When the officer responded, he too could hear noises coming from upstairs. He went to the storage space and saw the same man. The man ran into an adjacent room and the officer followed. When the officer turned the corner, the room was empty. There was no other way for the man to exit the room. The officer could tell that the boxes in the storage space had been moved because of lines left in the dust. Pretty freaky. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 44. This story was sent to me by Mike, who went on a ride-along with deputies in Manatee County, Florida. Mike and the deputies were in a wooded area and responded to a call. In an opening in the woods, they saw a humanoid creature with pink skin. It ran out of sight, and they couldn't find the creature anywhere. Sounds like something kind of hard to believe, right? This isn't the only sighting, however. There have been multiple 911 calls about people having seen this creature. There's even a social media group where locals have talked about their sightings. In one post, a lady talks about seeing a creature with floating flesh skin, no facial features, no hair, and being incredibly fast. What could it be? The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 45. This story was sent to me by a police officer in Cairo, Egypt. One night, this officer was stationed at a desert checkpoint. At the end of the shift, he left the checkpoint with his partners. They were about 150 kilometers away from the nearest city or town. In this area, it is common for drug dealers to hide just off the side of the road and signal to cars to buy drugs from them. While driving, the officers saw a man wearing a jalabia just standing off the side of the road. They stopped to investigate. The man ran up and over a sand berm and out of sight. The officers pursued and went over the sand berm about 4 seconds after the man. When they reached the top, they couldn't see him anywhere. What they did see, however, was what appeared to be a hairless dog running away from them on all fours. I've been getting a lot of stories about strange creatures lately. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 46. This was sent to me by a nephew of a trucker who had an encounter with a police officer. This trucker was driving on Highway 152 in California. He got pulled over by a highway patrol officer. It was odd though, because the police vehicle looked like an older 80s model unit. The officer gave him a ticket and left. Later on, the trucker went to the courthouse to fight the ticket. The judge looked at the ticket, got up and asked, "Do you think this is a joke?" The trucker said, "Why?" The judge told him that the officer's name and ID number used on the ticket belonged to an officer that had died on that freeway almost 40 years earlier. Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 47. This story was sent to me by a police officer in Iowa who wished to be anonymous. Several years ago, a young woman went missing, and there were extensive searches for her body. This officer volunteered from out of the area to search for her. After spending the whole day searching, he and another officer went for a run. As they were cooling down after the jog, they heard a voice. It was someone asking for help. There was no yelling, and the voice remained calm. They shouted out for the individual and tried to look for who was speaking. They couldn't find anyone. Several days later, and after about a month of being missing, the woman's killer was found. He confessed to killing her weeks prior and led law enforcement to where he hid her body. The spot was within a half a mile of where the officers heard the voice asking for help. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 48. This story was sent to me by the son of a police officer in London. One night on patrol, he got a call about a car that had crashed in the middle of the forest. It ran off the road and off the edge of a bank. The officer arrived at the road where the call came out and got behind a van that was in front of him. He could see the emergency lights ahead of him from the emergency personnel who were already on scene. Suddenly, he heard a loud screech, and the van slid from the roadway, down the bank, and crashed into a tree. The police officer stopped to investigate. When he got out of his patrol vehicle, he heard a loud metallic scratching noise coming from the van. He ran down the bank to help the occupants of the vehicle, but couldn't find anyone inside. What he did find, however, was what appeared to be deep claw marks on the side of the van. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 49. This story was sent to me on Instagram by a police officer who worked for the Watervliet Arsenal Police Department in New York. There was a structure there they called Building 10. One night, he and a partner were locking up the building because it housed the base commander's office. The police officer locked one of the doors, and when he turned around, he saw someone run down a breezeway. This was the only staircase and entrance to the basement area of the building. He called out to his partner and let him know that someone ran away from him. They searched the entire basement, but it was completely empty. Maybe just one of those trick of the eyes. A few days later, that officer drove by the building again. He looked up at one of the attic windows and saw a person staring at him. He shined his spotlight at the person, and they vanished. Needless to say, that officer never went in that building alone again. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 50. This story comes from a police officer in Japan. It happened at the Aokigahara forest. One day while on patrol, a police officer heard a woman cry for help near the edge of the forest. He rushed in to assist, and he found her. She told him she was out enjoying a hike when she got lost and asked for his help to find a way out. The police officer showed her the way. He noticed a unique scarf the woman was wearing, and he complimented her on it. She told the officer her mother made it for her by hand when she was a little girl. Once they got to the edge of the forest, they said goodbye. The next day, the officer responded to a report of hikers coming across a body in the forest. He responded and was in shock with what he saw. The badly decomposed body wore that same scarf the woman the previous day had worn. The woman had been dead for weeks. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Episode 51. This story was sent to me on Instagram by the son of a police officer in the Manchester Police Force. There is a 300-year-old abandoned mansion that is still fitted with an alarm system to keep out intruders. One night the alarm went off, and this officer met up with the canine unit in front of the house. The dog was described as being very tough and not scared of a thing, but it refused to go near the house. The officers searched the entire inside and found nothing but dead crows and dead rats. After the house was clear, they went outside to check on the dog. It was whining and staring up at the house. The officers followed the dog's line of sight and saw it was looking at an attic window. Inside the window, the officers could see a man wearing Victorian-era clothing staring back at them. For a moment, they stared at each other until the man took a step backwards and out of sight. The officer rushed back inside, looking for the man. Again, no one was found. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Episode 52. This story is from a correctional officer at a prison in Pendleton, Oregon. At about 2 a.m. on a graveyard shift, an officer was alone at his desk. He looked up to observe the dark cell block and saw an inmate standing in the middle of the room. The officer told the man to get back inside the cell. He refused and didn't move. The officer radioed for a sergeant to assist him. The sergeant arrived and also ordered the man to return to the cell, but he continued to refuse. The sergeant began to approach the inmate with his pepper spray drawn. The sergeant told the officer to turn on the lights. He got closer and closer to the inmate. As soon as the lights turned on, the inmate disappeared. There was no one there, but they had both seen a figure. You see, this prison has a lot of history. It used to be a state mental hospital. When it was converted to a prison, there were 100 unmarked jars of cremated remains found in tunnels underneath. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Episode 53. This is a story that made international news in Scotland in 2016. Police officers were called to a residence by a homeowner. The house was occupied by a woman and her young son. She was in fear because objects around the house had been moving on their own. Police officers originally thought this was going to be a mental health issue, but they were wrong. They arrived and spoke with the homeowner about what was happening. During that initial conversation, one officer heard a noise coming from the kitchen and went to investigate. As she walked in, the oven door slammed shut with no one around it. After that, a kitchen towel flew past her head like someone had thrown it. They called for a supervisor who arrived at the house. He walked in and observed the sofa and lampshades moving on their own. The family's chihuahua randomly appeared on a 7-foot hedge. Police determined there was nothing they could do to help the family, so a priest was called to bless the house. You can read more about this online. Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Episode 54. Imagine being alone and having this encounter. An abandoned apartment complex in California was known for being a high-crime area. The apartment was cleared and scheduled for demolition. The sender of this story, a security officer, was assigned to guard the complex at night. One night he patrolled the outside of the complex. Suddenly, he heard a scream coming from inside. He saw a light on in a window of the 3rd floor. He looked closer and saw a woman standing in the window looking at him. He went up to investigate and saw it was apartment number 329. He yelled to whoever was inside the apartment to come out, but no one answered. He went inside but found no one there. The light was still on, and he looked at the window where he saw the woman. He noticed something odd. There was what appeared to be a blood stain underneath the window. Just then the light turned off and the door slammed shut. He ran outside the apartment and found no one there. He did some research and found out a woman was brutally murdered by her husband in apartment 329. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, episode 55. This story is from a police officer in South Africa. He responded to an alarm call at a school with two of his partners. They searched the campus and found an open bathroom door. The door had a padlock on it that was open. It was the only locked bathroom on the campus. They all three walked in. Each had an uneasy feeling, but the bathroom was empty. They left, shut the door, and secured the padlock. As they were walking away, one officer realized he left his flashlight in the bathroom. They turned back to see if they could get inside to get it. They walked up to the door, and it flew open on its own. The padlock landed on the floor next to them. They decided the flashlight was not worth it, and they left. The next morning, they talked to school officials about what happened and why the bathroom was locked. They said an 8-year-old girl died in that bathroom years before. Since her death, that door has been replaced several times because it opens and closes violently. The officer never found his flashlight. He did find small scratch marks on his leg that looked like they were caused by a child. Scariest Things Police Have Seen. Have you ever thought that old abandoned boats were creepy? You might after this video. This story comes from a security guard at a shipyard in Channelview, Texas. One night he patrolled a shipyard that was supposed to be empty. At about 2 a.m. he saw a man working on one of the boats that was in the repair section. He told him to leave, but the man completely ignored the guard. The guard climbed the ladder to get to the top of the boat to detain the man. When he got to the top, the man was gone. It was like he completely vanished into thin air. He searched all around but couldn't find the man. The boat was too high off the ground for anyone to safely jump off. In the morning after his shift, the guard spoke with the manager and told him what he saw. The manager said he didn't have anyone working that night. But years prior, someone had been working on that very boat and accidentally fell to their death. It is now believed that the boat is haunted by that man's ghost. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen. This story is from a Texas police officer who responded to an emotional alarm call at an old funeral home. The door was unlocked, so this officer and his partner began clearing each room to ensure there was no one inside. They cleared every room in the entire building. After checking a room, they would prop open a door to make sure they knew as a tactic that they had already checked that room. There was no one inside the funeral home except for a few dead bodies. On their way out, they walked down the main hall where they entered through. They passed a door that was shut, but they were certain they had checked that room already. They opened the door and found the room was empty. As they walked out of the room, they heard a loud bang coming from the very back of the funeral home where they kept the bodies. They knew the building was clear, but they felt very uneasy, so they went outside to wait for the owner. When the owner showed up, they told him about what happened. The owner said he wasn't surprised, because in his 30 years of working there, he had definitely seen people walking around while he was alone. Imagine how scary it would be to be an inmate in a haunted prison. This story comes from a guard at a prison in New Mexico. He worked at the facility segregation unit where inmates are kept alone. One night after lights were out, this guard began conducting security checks. He was on the second tier when a new inmate stopped him and asked him to talk to the guy in the cell next door. All night long, there had been knocking on the wall in between their two cells. The complaining inmate yelled at him to stop several times. Every time he yelled, the pounding would stop, but would resume shortly after. The guard looked inside the cell and told the inmate it was completely empty. The guard returned to his colleagues and told them about what the inmate had said. His colleagues informed him that the last person to reside inside that cell was an inmate who hung himself just days prior. I'm about to show you possible paranormal activity caught on camera at a jail in London, Kentucky. The person who sent me the video is a former corrections officer at the facility. The video focuses on a cell that's supposed to be empty. And remember, correctional officers check cells almost every hour.
It's goddamn creepy. Alright. Is there nobody in that cell?
No!
Nobody's in that cell.
No,
It's closed right there.
when we was waiting for it still there a while ago at 12:12 and there was a...
Oh, that's freaking smart.
If you didn't see it, it looks like someone moves in front of the window. Remember, it's a jail, and the only way in or out is through that door you're looking at. This is a terrifying story from police officers in Richmond, Virginia. One night, several residents in a neighborhood called and complained about hearing yelling and screaming coming from inside a house. The officers got on scene and found the front door was ajar. They made their way inside and clearly heard yelling and screaming coming from upstairs. The staircase was narrow and provided little cover for the officers, so they yelled from downstairs and told them to stop fighting and come out. Their commands were ignored, and they continued to hear the sound of the fight escalating. The officers grabbed a shield and formed an entry team to make their way upstairs and stop the disturbance. Once the officers got to the landing, the screaming and shouting stopped. The officers again ordered whoever was fighting to come out, but all they heard was silence. They checked every inch of that house, but it was completely empty. The officers spoke with the neighbors about the incident. They were confused because the people who used to live in that house moved away abruptly for no given reason.